The silent judgment. The jet bridge hummed faintly under Amari Bennett's polished shoes as he boarded the plane. As one of the youngest black captains in the airline's history, every step he took felt like a statement, a reminder of how far he had come. His dark blue uniform fit perfectly, the gold captain's wings on his chest gleaming. This wasn't just a uniform. It was a badge of perseverance, countless hours of training, and an unyielding determination to prove his worth. Amari glanced around as he entered the cabin. First-class passengers had already started settling into their plush leather seats. A well-dressed businessman barked at a flight attendant about needing a pre-flight drink, while a young mother struggled with her toddler's seatbelt a few rows behind him. Amari's eyes flicked to the cabin crew stationed near the front. Captain Bennett, the lead flight attendant, Heather, greeted him, her smile tight but professional. She looked like someone who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything anymore. "Heather," he replied with a nod. "Smooth skies today." "Should be," she replied, but her gaze lingered on him for a fraction too long, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Amari ignored it. He was used to looks like that, quiet judgment disguised as indifference. Amari continued to the cockpit, where his co-pilot, Todd, was already seated, running through pre-flight checks. Todd glanced up and gave a friendly nod. "Morning, Captain. Ready to fly?" "Always," Amari said, sliding into his seat. The cockpit had always been his sanctuary, a place where skill, precision, and focus mattered more than anything else. Out here, it didn't matter what people thought of him or how they judged him for his skin color. He belonged here as much as anyone. As they prepared for takeoff, Amari's thoughts briefly drifted to the path that had brought him here. Growing up in a small southern town, he'd faced endless questions and skepticism about his ambitions. A pilot? People would say, their voices tinged with disbelief. But he hadn't just wanted to fly. He had wanted to soar, to break barriers that had long been cemented by prejudice. And now, here he was, a proud captain at 32. The flight went smoothly for the first hour. Passengers settled into their routines. Businessmen buried in laptops, families navigating restless children, and couples dozing in their reclined seats. Amari allowed himself a moment of peace, the rhythmic hum of the engines soothing as he maintained the plane's steady course. But then the intercom buzzed. "Captain Bennett." Heather's voice came through, tense. "We have a situation in first class." Amari sighed, exchanging a glance with Todd. "I'll handle it," he said, unbuckling his harness. Stepping into the cabin, Amari found Heather standing stiffly near an agitated passenger. The businessman from earlier, his face flushed with anger, was standing, gesturing wildly toward another passenger. "My wallet's gone," he snapped. "It was in my pocket when I boarded, and now it's missing. Someone here took it." The cabin fell silent. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, tension thick in the air. Amari's eyes scanned the scene, landing on the accused, a middle-aged black woman sitting quietly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap. She met the businessman's glare with a calm yet defiant expression. "Sir," Amari said, his voice calm but commanding, "let's de-escalate this situation. Are you certain it's missing? Could it have fallen under your seat?" The businessman sneered. "I know it didn't just walk away. She's the only one who could have taken it." The woman raised an eyebrow, her voice steady. "You've made quite an assumption. Care to explain why?" Heather intervened nervously. "Maybe we should check the area first, Captain Bennett." Amari hesitated. His instinct told him to defuse the situation carefully, but he knew how quickly these things could spiral. Passengers were watching, their eyes darting between him and the scene unfolding. "Fine," the businessman barked. "But I want her searched too." The woman stood, her back straight and her voice unwavering. "If you're searching my bag, I expect everyone here to have theirs searched as well." Heather looked to Amari for direction, her face pale. This was a powder keg waiting to explode, and the wrong move could ignite it. "Enough," Mary said firmly. He turned to the businessman. "Sir, please sit down. We'll resolve this professionally." Heather began searching the surrounding seats. As Mary turned to help, he caught Heather's glance, a fleeting moment that conveyed an unspoken message. He wasn't just the captain in her eyes right now. He was the black captain, and how he handled this would define how everyone judged him. Minutes passed as Heather checked under the seats and inside the woman's bag. Nothing. The businessman grew more agitated, muttering under his breath about incompetence and letting things slide. Mary's patience was wearing thin. Finally, Heather stood. "It's not here." Mary turned to the businessman. "Sir, there's no evidence to support your claim against this passenger. I suggest we move on." The businessman's face turned crimson. "Move on? Are you serious? I paid for this seat, and I expect—" "You expect what?" The accused woman interrupted, her voice sharp. "To humiliate me for your own satisfaction. To have your baseless accusations validated." Mary raised a hand, his voice firm. "That's enough. We're done here." The businessman scowled but returned to his seat, grumbling. The woman sat down, her composure unbroken, though her hands trembled faintly. Heather leaned toward Mary. "Captain, should we involve security when we land?" Mary glanced at her, incredulous. "Why?" "Because someone made an unfounded accusation." Heather hesitated but nodded reluctantly. "Understood, sir." Mary returned to the cockpit. His stomach knotted. He knew the fallout from this incident wasn't over. The weight of his uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt heavier than ever. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully on the surface, but beneath the calm exterior, emotions churned. Passengers whispered among themselves. The businessman glared daggers at anyone who looked his way. And in the cockpit, Mary couldn't shake the sense that the storm brewing inside the plane wasn't just about a missing wallet. As they prepared for landing, Heather's voice crackled over the intercom. "Security will meet us at the gate. Please remain seated until instructed to disembark." Mary's jaw tightened. This was far from over. He glanced at Todd, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Everything okay?" Todd asked. "No," Mary replied quietly. "But I'll handle it." The plane touched down, and Mary braced himself for what awaited. The accused woman would not go quietly, nor should she, and Mary knew that this was just the beginning of a confrontation that went far beyond the confines of the cabin. This was a battle of dignity, respect, and justice, and Mary was ready to stand at the front lines. The ripple of assumptions. The plane had barely rolled to a stop at the gate when the tension that had simmered during the flight boiled over. Passengers began to whisper amongst themselves, their conversations subdued but sharp. Through the small window of the cockpit, Captain Amari Bennett could see two uniformed security officers waiting on the tarmac below. Their stern faces were framed by the rotating amber lights of a security vehicle parked just outside the gate. Amari leaned back in his seat and sighed deeply. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more, the businessman's baseless accusation or Heather's quick decision to escalate the matter by calling security. Both were problems, but one was born from ignorance, while the other stemmed from a systemic issue Mary had seen too many times before. Todd, his co-pilot, glanced over nervously. "You think this is going to blow up?" he asked, fidgeting with the edge of his uniform sleeve. "It already has," Amari replied, his tone clipped. He unbuckled his harness, his mind racing. He wasn't just a pilot today. He was now at the center of a situation fraught with assumptions, bias, and injustice. Amari exited the cockpit and made his way toward the front of the plane, where Heather was briefing the waiting security officers. The accused woman, whose name he had learned was Eleanor Lewis, sat stiffly in her seat, her face a mask of calm despite the storm swirling around her. The businessman who had accused her glared at her with open disdain, his lips curled in frustration. "Captain Bennett," Heather said as he approached, her voice carefully neutral. "Security would like to speak with you about the situation before anyone disembarks." Amari nodded curtly, his gaze flicking to the officers. Both looked uncomfortable, their body language hesitant. They weren't here because they believed a crime had been committed. They were here because someone had called them, and protocol demanded they respond. "Gentlemen," Amari began, his voice steady but firm. "What exactly do you need from me?" The older of the two officers, a man with a graying beard and weary eyes, cleared his throat. "We were told there was a theft on board, and that a passenger was implicated. We're here to determine the facts and ensure the safety of everyone involved." Amari's jaw tightened. "There's no evidence to suggest a theft occurred, and Ms. Lewis has already had her belongings searched. Nothing was found." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Even so, Captain, we'd like to speak with her. It's just protocol." "There's that word again." Eleanor's voice cut through the conversation. She stood, her movements deliberate and controlled, and addressed the officers directly. "Protocol. I've heard it used many times, and it always seems to come up in situations like this. Can you explain to me what protocol demands when someone like me is accused without evidence?" The officers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. The younger one opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eleanor took a step forward, her voice rising just enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Do you realize what you're doing right now? You're not investigating a crime. You're perpetuating a narrative that people like me are suspect by default. You're reinforcing the idea that an accusation, no matter how baseless, is enough to warrant public humiliation." The businessman scoffed from his seat. "Oh, give it a rest. If you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide." Eleanor turned to face him, her composure unwavering. "And if you truly believed I'd stolen your wallet, why did you single me out? Why not the person sitting next to you, or across the aisle? What made you look at me and think, it must be her?" The businessman opened his mouth to retort but faltered. His face flushed crimson as the weight of her words pressed down on him. Amari took a step forward, positioning himself between Eleanor and the officers. "This is getting out of hand," he said, addressing both the security team and the cabin crew. "Ms. Lewis deserves to be treated with respect, not as a scapegoat for someone else's assumptions. If this incident continues to escalate, it won't just reflect poorly on the airline. It'll reflect poorly on everyone involved." Heather looked visibly uncomfortable, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "Captain, I was just following procedure." "And that's part of the problem," Amari interrupted, his tone sharp. "Procedure without discretion is just another way to excuse poor judgment." The older officer raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's all take a step back. Ms. Lewis, if you're willing, we'd like to speak with you privately in the terminal. You're not under suspicion. We just want to close this out properly." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Fine, but only if Captain Bennett accompanies me. I trust his judgment more than anyone else here." Amari felt a flicker of pride at her words, but it was tempered by frustration. He nodded and motioned for Eleanor to follow him toward the exit. As they stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, the murmurs of the other passengers followed them like an unwelcome chorus. Eleanor walked with her head held high, her poise unbroken despite the indignity of the situation. Amari walked beside her, his presence a silent show of solidarity. The private room, where the security officers led them, was stark and clinical, with plain white walls and a single table surrounded by metal chairs. Eleanor sat down, her movements deliberate and composed, while Amari stood behind her, his arms crossed. "Ms. Lewis," the older officer began, his tone softer now. "We just need to document what happened. Can you confirm your account of the events?" Eleanor recounted the incident calmly, her voice steady despite the underlying anger she clearly felt. She described the businessman's accusation, the invasive search of her belongings, and the humiliation of being singled out without cause. When she finished, the room fell silent. The younger officer hesitated, then cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I'm sorry this happened. It's clear to me that this was handled poorly." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "Sorry isn't enough. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but it was Ameri who stepped forward. "She's right," he said. "This isn't just about this flight or this incident. This is about a pattern, a culture, that allows these situations to happen. And unless we address that, nothing will change." The older officer nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. I'll make sure this incident is documented properly and forwarded to the appropriate channels. Beyond that, well, I think there's a conversation to be had with the airline about how situations like this are handled." Eleanor stood, her posture commanding. "See that you do, because the next time this happens, I won't just be speaking to security. I'll be speaking to the media." As they left the room and walked toward the main terminal, Ameri couldn't help but feel a deep respect for Eleanor's strength. She had stood her ground against a tide of prejudice and ignorance, refusing to let the situation break her. But Ameri also knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much larger fight, one that he too was ready to join. Beyond the terminal walls, the air inside the terminal was thick with tension, despite the ordinary bustle of travelers rushing to catch flights. Ameri Bennett and Eleanor Lewis walked side by side, their shared silence heavier than the clamor of the airport. The eyes of passengers, some curious, others indifferent, followed them as they moved toward the airline's private lounge. Though neither spoke, an unspoken camaraderie bound them now, forged in the furnace of what they had just endured. As they entered the lounge, Eleanor stopped and turned to face Ameri. Her sharp gaze softened just enough to let him see the exhaustion beneath her stoic exterior. "Thank you for standing with me," she said, her voice low but steady. Ameri nodded. "It wasn't just for you," he replied, his tone resolute. "It was for everyone who's been in your shoes, and mine." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. "That's why it matters." Before either could say more, the lounge door swung open, and James Callahan, the regional manager for the airline, strode in. His polished suit and slicked back hair gave him an air of authority, but the tightness around his mouth suggested he already knew this was not going to be an easy conversation. "Captain Bennett, Ms. Lewis," Callahan greeted them with a clipped nod. "I've been briefed about the incident. Let's sit down and discuss how to move forward." The three of them settled into a corner of the lounge, away from the prying eyes of other passengers. Callahan adjusted his tie, his movements fidgety. "First, let me apologize on behalf of the airline for the inconvenience and distress caused today. We take matters like this very seriously." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Inconvenience," she repeated, her voice sharp. "Is that what we're calling public humiliation now?" Callahan flinched but recovered quickly. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Lewis. Rest assured, we will conduct a full investigation into this matter." Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "And what does that investigation entail, exactly? Because what happened today wasn't just about a wallet or a misunderstanding. It was about bias, plain and simple." Ameri added, "Ms. Lewis is right. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, a culture that tolerates these kinds of assumptions. If you're serious about addressing this, it needs to go beyond a simple apology or internal investigation." Callahan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I hear you, both of you. But change doesn't happen overnight. These things take time." "Time," Eleanor shot back. "Do you know how long people like me have been waiting for time to fix things? It's always the same story. Be patient, change is coming. But while we wait, we're the ones paying the price." Callahan opened his mouth to respond, but Ameri cut him off. "Eleanor's right. And if you think this ends here, you're mistaken. This is going to ripple far beyond this lounge, this airport, or even this airline." The regional manager stared at them, his expression conflicted. Finally, he nodded. "You've made your point. I'll escalate this to the corporate office. In the meantime, we'll cover your rebooking and accommodations." Eleanor leaned back, her arms crossed. Do what you have to do, Mr. Callahan. But understand this, if nothing changes, I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here." With that, she stood and walked toward the lounge's large glass windows, staring out at the runways where planes taxied under the fading sunlight. Ameri stayed seated, his gaze fixed on Callahan. "This isn't just about one flight, James," Ameri said quietly. "This is about how we, as a company, treat people. If we can't get that right, we've already failed." Callahan nodded again, his shoulders slumping slightly as he rose. "You're right, Amari. I'll do my part. But I'll be honest, changing a culture this ingrained is going to be an uphill battle." "It always is," Amari replied. "But someone has to start." The unexpected ally. Later that evening, Amari sat in the airline's break room, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The weight of the day hung heavy on him, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hesitant footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Heather, the lead flight attendant, standing in the doorway. "Captain Bennett," she said softly. "Do you have a minute?" Amari gestured for her to sit. Heather perched on the edge of the chair across from him, her hands twisting the hem of her blouse. "I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I shouldn't have called security. I panicked, and I thought I was following the right procedure. But you didn't think about what that procedure really meant." Amari finished for her, his tone gentle but firm. Heather nodded, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't, and I see now how wrong it was. I was so focused on diffusing the situation that I didn't stop to consider how it would escalate things for Ms. Lewis, and for you." Amari studied her for a moment, then set his mug down. "Heather, I appreciate you coming to me with this. Admitting you were wrong is the first step. But if you really want to make things right, you have to do more than apologize." Heather frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean you need to speak up," Amari said. "Not just to me, but to your colleagues, to management. Share what you've learned from this. Use your voice to advocate for change." Heather hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll do it. I want to be better." "We all do," Amari replied. "The question is whether we're willing to put in the work." The ripples begin. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters for a scheduled meeting with Amari and James Callahan. As she walked through the sleek, glass-lined halls, she noticed employees glancing at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. She ignored them, her focus unwavering. In the boardroom, Amari and Callahan were already waiting. Callahan stood as she entered, offering a polite nod. "Ms. Lewis, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Eleanor sat down, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I'm here because I want to see what you're actually going to do about this," she said bluntly. Callahan cleared his throat, sliding a folder across the table. "This is the initial draft of our response plan. It includes mandatory bias training for all staff, a review of existing protocols, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to handle complaints." Eleanor opened the folder and skimmed the contents. After a moment, she looked up. "This is a start," she said. "But it's not enough. Training and committees are fine, but they won't change anything unless you're willing to hold people accountable, starting with Captain Harley." Amari's jaw tightened. "She's right," he said, his voice firm. "Harley's actions weren't just a lapse in judgment. They were a blatant abuse of authority. If we don't address that directly, we're sending the message that this behavior is acceptable." Callahan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll speak with HR. Disciplinary action will be taken." Eleanor nodded. "Good, because if you sweep this under the rug, I'll make sure everyone knows." The meeting ended, but as Eleanor and Amari walked out together, she turned to him with a small smile. "You're not what I expected, Captain Bennett." He raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" "Someone who'd stay quiet to protect their job," she replied. "But you've shown me there are still people willing to stand up for what's right." Amari smiled faintly. That's because I know what's at stake. This isn't just about today. It's about tomorrow. And I'm not about to let people like Harley define that for us. Eleanor nodded. Neither am I. As they stepped into the crisp morning air, both knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, they felt the faint stirrings of hope. Together, they had started a ripple, one they hoped would grow into a wave. The spark of change. The echoes of Eleanor Lewis's bold words and Amari Bennett's unwavering support continued to ripple through the corridors of the airline's corporate offices. By the following week, whispers had turned into conversations, and conversations had started to grow into debates. Employees at all levels, from ground crew to executive staff, began questioning the systems and attitudes that allowed prejudice to persist unchallenged. Amari sat in his office, reviewing reports on flight safety when a soft knock interrupted him. He looked up to see Marcus Yates, the airline's general counsel, standing in the doorway. Marcus was a sharp, no-nonsense man known for his pragmatic approach, but today his expression seemed unusually grave. "Got a minute?" Marcus asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Amari gestured toward a chair. "What's on your mind?" Marcus slid a thick folder onto Amari's desk. "This is the preliminary report from the internal investigation into Captain Harley and the flight incident." Amari opened the folder, skimming the contents. As his eyes scanned the pages, his jaw tightened. The report was damning. It wasn't just the incident with Eleanor. Harley's record showed a pattern of complaints, many of them tied to similar behavior, bias, intimidation, and an inability to manage conflict without escalating it. "They buried this," Amari muttered, flipping through the pages. How did he stay in his position with this kind of history? Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Because it was easier. Complaints like these are usually dealt with quietly, if at all. Harley's numbers looked good on paper, on-time flights, safety records, efficiency metrics. No one wanted to rock the boat. Amari set the folder down, his frustration mounting. "So we've been prioritizing convenience over accountability, and now it's blowing up in our faces." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. And it's not just Harley. The deeper we dig, the more we're finding. This isn't one bad apple, Amari. It's systemic." Amari sat back, running a hand over his face. He had suspected as much, but seeing it laid out in black and white was another matter entirely. "What's the plan?" he asked finally. "That's where you come in," Marcus replied. "The executive team wants you and Eleanor to help lead the task force we're forming to address this. They think your credibility, both with employees and the public, can help salvage our reputation." Amari's eyes narrowed. "And you? What do you think?" Marcus hesitated, then sighed. "I think they're right. But I also think they're using you to clean up a mess they let fester for years." Amari's lips thinned into a grim line. "Good, because I'm not interested in cleaning up their mess. I'm interested in fixing the problem." Eleanor takes the stage. Meanwhile, Eleanor was preparing for a different battle. At her request, the airline had arranged for a town hall meeting, inviting employees and passengers alike to share their experiences and discuss the changes the company needed to make. The event was unprecedented, and its announcement had sent shockwaves through the company. The town hall was held in a large auditorium at the airline's headquarters, its walls lined with banners proclaiming the company's commitment to safety, service, and integrity. Eleanor stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to her blazer. She had spoken in front of crowds before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, unwelcome, or unworthy. As she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Employees, passengers, and even members of the media filled the rows of seats, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. Eleanor took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Eleanor Lewis, and I'm here today not as a victim, but as a voice. A voice for those who have been silenced by prejudice, overlooked by indifference, and dismissed by a system that values convenience over justice. She paused, letting her words settle over the audience. What happened to me on Flight 327 was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that affects not just passengers, but employees, communities, and our entire society. And it's a problem that will not be solved with empty apologies or surface-level reforms. Eleanor's eyes swept the room, meeting the gazes of the airline's top executives seated in the front row. Change is not comfortable, she continued. It is not easy, but it is necessary. And it starts with accountability. Not just for individuals like Captain Harley, but for the systems that allowed him to act without consequence. The room erupted into applause. Eleanor waited for the noise to die down before stepping back from the podium, signaling the start of the open forum. One by one, employees and passengers came forward to share their stories. Stories of bias, mistreatment, and being made to feel less than. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of resolve in the room. The turning point. Amari watched the town hall from the side of the stage, his arms crossed and his expression thoughtful. He had always known the airline had issues, but hearing the raw, unfiltered stories from those it had failed hit him harder than he expected. When the forum ended, he joined Eleanor on stage. The audience fell silent again as he took the microphone. I want to thank every one of you who spoke today. Amari began. Your courage is what will drive this change. But I also want to say this. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires all of us to be part of the solution. He turned to the executives in the front row. That includes you. You can't sit in your offices and expect the culture to change around you. You have to lead by example. You have to make hard decisions, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. Amari's gaze swept the room. And to my fellow employees, whether you're a pilot, a flight attendant, or part of the ground crew, you have a role to play too. Speak up when you see something wrong. Support each other. Demand better. Because if we don't hold ourselves accountable, no one else will. The room erupted into applause again, louder this time, as Amari and Eleanor stepped off the stage together. The storm within. That evening, back in his office, Amari sat alone, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He knew this was only the beginning. The town hall had been a powerful moment, but moments didn't create change. Movements did, and movements required momentum, commitment, and perseverance. As he looked out the window at the planes lined up on the tarmac, their lights glowing faintly in the darkness, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it. For the first time in a long time, Amari didn't feel like he was standing alone. Eleanor's voice, the voices of the employees and passengers who had shared their stories, they were all part of something bigger. And together, they were going to create the change the airline so desperately needed. The weight of legacy. The days following the town hall were a whirlwind of meetings, proposals, and endless conversations. Change had been promised, but now it needed to be delivered, a task more monumental than anyone had anticipated. Amari Bennett, Eleanor Lewis, and Marcus Yates found themselves at the center of it all, spearheading a task force that had been both celebrated and scrutinized across the company. Amari sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of documents and notes from the task force's first few sessions. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, mirroring the tension in his mind. He thumbed through one particularly damning report, detailing a string of complaints that had been ignored over the years. Complaints from employees of color who had faced bias and discrimination, only to have their concerns buried in bureaucracy. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Eleanor. Eleanor, we need to talk. I just uncovered something big. Meet me in conference room B. Amari felt his stomach tighten. Eleanor's instincts were rarely wrong, and when she said something was big, it usually was. He grabbed his notes and headed down the hallway, his polished shoes echoing against the tile floors. When he entered the conference room, Eleanor was already there, her laptop open, and several papers spread out across the table. Her expression was a mix of anger and determination. "Amari," she began without preamble, "I found something you need to see." She slid a document across the table toward him. It was an email chain between senior management and the HR department, dated over a year ago. As Amari read, his face darkened. This is bad," he muttered. The emails detailed an internal complaint filed by a young black flight attendant who had reported repeated instances of harassment and bias from her supervisor. The response from HR was chillingly dismissive, suggesting the employee focus on improving her performance instead of escalating minor workplace conflicts. "She quit 2 months after this email," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "And she wasn't the only one. I found at least 3 other employees with similar stories, all swept under the rug." Amari felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. This isn't just negligence. This is a pattern of deliberate inaction. Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. And if we don't address it head-on, nothing we're doing here will matter." The meeting that changed everything. That afternoon, Amari and Eleanor presented their findings to the task force. The room was filled with representatives from every level of the airline: executives, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and even a few passengers who had volunteered to be part of the change. Eleanor began, her voice steady but passionate. "What we're dealing with isn't just a few bad actors or isolated incidents. It's a culture that prioritizes image over integrity, comfort over accountability. These emails are just the tip of the iceberg." She gestured to the documents projected on the screen behind her. "This is what happens when a company values silence over action. And it's not just employees who suffer. Our passengers feel it too." Amari took over, his tone firm. "We can't fix this overnight, but we can start by acknowledging the truth. That means accountability, not just for individuals, but for the systems that allowed this to happen." One of the executives, a middle-aged man named Peter Langston, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Amari, Eleanor," he began, his voice measured, "I appreciate your passion. But let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. We're running a business here. Drastic measures could hurt our bottom line." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And what's the cost of doing nothing, Peter? How many more employees will we lose? How many passengers will stop flying with us because they don't trust us to treat them with dignity?" Amari added, "This isn't just about business, it's about legacy. Do we want to be remembered as the company that buried its problems, or the one that faced them head-on?" The room fell silent. Marcus Yates, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "They're right. If we don't act now, we're not just risking lawsuits or bad PR. We're risking the trust of everyone who works for and flies with us. And once that's gone, it's almost impossible to get back." Langston sighed but nodded reluctantly. "What do you propose?" The action plan. Over the next few weeks, the task force worked tirelessly to develop a comprehensive action plan. The key components included mandatory bias training for all employees from the C-suite to the ground crew, focusing on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias, a new reporting system, an independent third-party platform for employees and passengers to report issues without fear of retaliation, accountability measures, a clear, transparent process for investigating complaints and holding individuals accountable, regardless of their rank or tenure, leadership restructuring, a review of current leadership to ensure those in positions of power reflected the airline's commitment to diversity and equity, public commitment, a formal statement acknowledging the airline's failures and outlining its plan for change, shared openly with employees, passengers, and the public. The work was grueling, and the pushback from some quarters was intense. But for every doubter, there were also supporters, people inspired by Amari and Eleanor's courage, who were willing to stand alongside them. A message from the past. One evening, as Amari was reviewing the final draft of the action plan, He received a message from an unknown number. It was a video file. Curious, he opened it. The video was grainy, clearly recorded on a phone, and showed an older black man in a pilot's uniform. Mary's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man. Captain Elijah Grant, one of the first black pilots in the airline's history and a personal hero of Mary's. In the video, Elijah spoke directly to the camera. "To whoever's watching this, I want you to know something. The fight you're in isn't new. I've been in it my whole life. Back when I started flying, people like me weren't just doubted. We were dismissed outright. But we didn't back down. We stood our ground and opened doors for the next generation." He paused, his expression fierce. "But opening doors isn't enough. You have to keep them open. You have to make sure the people who come after you don't face the same struggles you did. That's the real legacy. So, if you're in a position to make change, do it. Not for yourself, but for everyone who's counting on you." Mary stared at the screen long after the video ended, his chest tight. Elijah's words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the responsibility he now carried. The moment of truth. The action plan was officially unveiled at a company-wide meeting, streamed live to employees and passengers around the world. Mary and Eleanor stood side by side on the stage, their presence a symbol of unity and resolve. As Mary spoke, he felt the weight of Elijah's words guiding him. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," he said, his voice steady. "It's about building something better, something that reflects the values we claim to stand for. Integrity, respect, justice. Those aren't just words. They're a promise. And today, we begin the work of making that promise real." The room erupted into applause. But Mary knew the applause wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be many. But for the first time, he felt certain they were moving in the right direction. As the meeting ended and people began to file out, Eleanor turned to him with a rare smile. "We're not done," she said. Mary smiled back. "Not by a long shot. The flight toward tomorrow." The day after the company-wide meeting, the air at the airline's headquarters buzzed with a sense of purpose. Employees at all levels had begun discussing the action plan, dissecting its details, questioning its implementation, and most importantly, acknowledging the need for it. Mary Bennett and Eleanor Lewis had done more than present a blueprint for change. They had sparked a movement. But as with any movement, not everyone embraced it. Mary stood in the corner of the employee break room, nursing a mug of tea while listening to a heated conversation between two senior pilots. Both were seasoned veterans, their uniforms crisp and their voices carrying the weight of years spent in the skies. "This whole thing is overblown," one pilot, Captain Frank Reynolds, said, his tone dismissive. "One incident doesn't mean the entire system is broken." The other pilot, Captain Maria Ortega, shook her head. "Frank, it's not just one incident. This has been going on for years. Just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it's not happening." Frank scoffed. "So what? We're all supposed to walk on eggshells now. People make mistakes. Calling it systemic bias is taking it too far." Mary set his mug down and stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. "It's not about walking on eggshells, Frank. It's about taking responsibility. When we ignore these issues, we're complicit in them." Frank's gaze shifted to Mary, his jaw tightening. "With all due respect, Captain Bennett, I think some of us are overcorrecting. You can't expect the entire culture of an airline to change overnight." "I don't," Mary replied evenly. "But I do expect us to start. And that means listening to the people who've been ignored for far too long." Marian nodded in agreement, her eyes narrowing at Frank. "You don't have to agree with everything, Frank, but you do have to accept that things can't stay the way they've been. If you can't do that, maybe you're the one who needs to adjust." Frank muttered something under his breath and walked out, leaving Mary and Maria in the suddenly quiet room. "Thanks for stepping in," Maria said, offering Mary a small smile. He nodded. This is just the beginning, Maria. There's a lot of resistance out there. We'll have to face it head on. I'm ready, she replied. And I think more people are with us than you realize. The first test. That afternoon, Mary received a call from Marcus Yates. The general counsel's tone was unusually urgent. Mary, we've got a situation. A passenger from one of last week's flights has come forward with a complaint against Harley. They're threatening legal action. Mary's stomach tightened. What's the complaint? Marcus sighed. Discrimination. It's eerily similar to what happened with Eleanor. Apparently, Harley accused this passenger, a young black man, of attempting to board with a fraudulent ticket. He humiliated him in front of other passengers and called security before verifying anything. Turns out the passenger's ticket was perfectly valid. Mary exhaled slowly, the weight of the news settling heavily on his shoulders. What's the plan? We've already escalated this to HR, Marcus said. But it's clear Harley's behavior is a liability. We're recommending immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Mary nodded. Good. This can't wait. Every day he stays in that cockpit sends the wrong message. Facing Harley. Later that week, Mary found himself face-to-face with Captain Harley for the first time since the incident on Flight 327. The meeting took place in a small conference room, with Marcus and an HR representative present to ensure protocol was followed. Harley sat stiffly, his arms crossed, and his face a mask of defiance. This is a witch hunt, he said the moment Mary entered the room. I've done nothing wrong. Mary took a seat across from him, his expression calm but unyielding. This isn't about a witch hunt, Harley. This is about accountability. Harley's eyes narrowed. Accountability. For what? Doing my job. Following protocol. Protocol doesn't excuse bias, Mary replied evenly. And it doesn't excuse humiliation or mistreatment. You've had multiple complaints filed against you, and instead of learning from them, you've doubled down. That ends now. Harley leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. You think you're better than me, Bennett. Just because you've got people clapping for you at town halls. You're nothing but a token, and you know it. Mary's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Harley's words rattle him. You're entitled to your opinion, Harley, but the facts speak for themselves. This isn't about me. It's about you and the choices you've made. Choices that have hurt people. Marcus intervened before the exchange could escalate further. Captain Harley, this meeting is to inform you of your suspension, effective immediately. You'll remain grounded pending the outcome of the investigation. Harley's face turned red, but he said nothing. He stood abruptly, grabbed his hat from the table, and stormed out of the room. Mary exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. That won't be the last we hear from him. No, it won't, Marcus agreed. But it's a start. The flight that changed everything. A month later, Mary and Eleanor boarded a flight together, not as captain and passenger, but as collaborators. The airline had invited them to participate in a special event celebrating the launch of their new diversity and equity initiative. It was a symbolic flight, with a diverse crew and passengers representing all walks of life. As the plane ascended into the clear blue sky, Mary looked around the cabin. He saw families, business travelers, and employees sharing stories and laughter. He saw hope. Eleanor, seated beside him, nudged his arm. You know, this is just the beginning, she said. I know, Mary replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But it feels good to finally be moving in the right direction. When the plane landed, the passengers and crew gathered for a brief ceremony at the gate. Mary and Eleanor were called to the front, where James Callahan presented them with plaques recognizing their contributions to the airline's transformation. This isn't just about what you've done for this company, Callahan said. It's about what you've done for everyone who believes in fairness, justice, and equality. Thank you for leading the way. The applause that followed was thunderous. For a moment, Mary allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still long. But they had made a difference. They had sparked a movement. As he and Eleanor walked away from the ceremony, she turned to him with a smile. "Think we've earned a break?" Mary chuckled. "Not yet. There's still plenty of work to do." "Good," she said, "because I'm not done fighting." "Neither am I," Mary replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. Together, they stepped out into the bustling terminal, ready to continue the journey toward a better future. Epilogue. The sky's the limit. Months later, the airline rolled out its new reporting system, mandatory training programs, and transparent accountability measures. Complaints were no longer swept under the rug, and employees felt empowered to speak up. Passengers began to notice the difference, too: more inclusive advertising, better service, and a renewed commitment to fairness. For Amari and Eleanor, the work never stopped. But every time they saw a young employee rise through the ranks without fear, or a passenger treated with dignity and respect, they knew it was worth it. The skies above were still vast and uncertain, but they were no longer stormy. And for the first time, Mary felt that everyone, regardless of who they were, had a chance to soar.